Hello everyone and welcome to Twilight Epiphanies Talk Radio with Cindy Magnuson, and the show is about to begin. So slow down, take a seat, put your feet up, and maybe take some notes, because this show is about you, it's for you, and it is designed to help you receive exactly what you need to be a happier and healthier you. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 38 of Twilight Epiphanies Radio. This is Cindy Magnuson, and tonight in this third show in this series, Our Altered Histories, I am welcoming Sylvie Ivanova of NewEarth and Megaliths.org. So tonight, as we're continuing this series, this is a continuance from the two shows previous to this. The last show that I did was with Jay Dreamers, and in his show, he was talking about his research into petrified stone, that in his opinion, he is finding that he believes some of our stone structures are actually petrified remains of titans that existed in the past and actually did battle with, in the stories that we see in Greek mythology and the Bible, that there were actually giants and titans at one time that did go to battle. And in his further researches, he looks at putting together cartoons and comics, TV shows, and movies, and looking at how bits and pieces of our history are also interspersed within those medias and reminding us and having memories of what took place in the past. My interjection into, as we continue along here, is that there are going to be very many different memories in general, because we likely are looking at millions of years of existence here, and thus it would be difficult to come to any one absolute conclusion as to how anything specifically played out through time. However, there is going to be a fundamental line of core truths that are found within each person here who comes on in this series. There is going to be that stream of truths, and those higher truths are that, one, our history has been kept from us, it has been altered, it has been interfered with, and it has been suggested to us to live different from ways that we lived in the past, which were more connected to nature and in a more community setting of sharing and caring, of which tonight Sylvie brings in from her childhood, growing up, having a lot of time on her grandparents' small farm in Bulgaria, as she watched her grandmother grow organic crops and then utilize, by giving away the excess food items to neighbors who were also doing the same, a caring and sharing that she would like to see more expressed in our world today. And for that, I honor Sylvie very much and have invited her in for that perspective in her heart. As a child, Sylvie came into this world with more of her memories intact from a lifetime in understanding more of the Vedic scriptures, and she carries with her, brought into this lifetime, those times of living in peace and harmony with others, and maintains her belief that we can continue to remember our past and bring ourselves slowly back again to a time frame where even advanced technologies can be utilized alongside our way of being close to the earth and nature and live in harmony with all. So today I welcome her onto the show. And Sylvie is going to be telling us about her research in her documentation of megalithic sites all over the world. Sylvia is the founder of both megaliths.org and the NewEarth channel, which has hundreds of videos already put together in her research, where she has gone on to document how what we have been told about these ancient structures around the world is a different interpretation than what she is seeing firsthand, and from her own memories of other lifetimes and her higher perspectives that she's reached in her own yogic style studies and conduction of her life. So I welcome Sylvia on. Hello, Sylvia. How are you?
Hello, Cindy. I'm fine. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the American people on your show. This is a precious opportunity for me. Thank you for that. And thank you for the sweet introduction.
Wonderful. You're welcome. It is very well earned. And so as we begin here, I would like to begin with some general perspectives that you have, first of all, researched and discovered in your studies and observations of what you're seeing. If I were to ask you what the first most prominent discovery was or is right now that you feel, if you are going to step out and talk to an audience, what would you first be telling them why it's significant that we are looking at this today?
It is really very hard to pick one single thing. So maybe out of the top of my head, I would say the ancient petrified vehicle tracks. Certainly they are the most interesting of everything I have found and seen so far, and the most mysterious. At this point, although I've been looking at them for years and in various countries, Spain, Turkey, Malta, Italy, Bulgaria, I'm not even sure that they are vehicle tracks. I still don't understand them. The more I see of them, the less I'm sure about everything I've been thinking about them or read about them. Just a few days we saw some new patch of such petrified tracks, and again they were like going in. They were turning into a staircase now and then, on and off. So that doesn't make much sense in terms of the usual vehicle tracks left in mud, for example, by our vehicles. So certainly that is the most mysterious and interesting. Is it the most significant? It's hard to say at this point, but I decided to pick up this one as most interesting.
Yes, okay. I have seen a couple of your very interesting videos on NewEarth channel of the ancient tracks, and yes, it's difficult to determine what could have been there. Again, it's helping the listeners to understand that we are walking on an earth that we generally do not understand what we are walking upon. And
exactly.
The videos that you have, then perhaps a good place to begin here, because as you said, it's difficult to find one point, but is a general understanding that this is about us remembering who we are as opposed to being told who we are in the big grand scheme of existence, and that life apparently seems to have been, would you say, scaled very differently. And perhaps this is even some type of tools being used through here at different times, and maybe not even vehicles. So there can be so many different types of explanations for the strange formations that appear to be vehicle tracks.
Yes, they are certainly one very interesting piece of the puzzle of the lost history. And but there are many others, like, for example, it was my honor to introduce this idea of the stolen history of the country Tartaria, which was the biggest on Earth. I was the first one to bring up this topic in the English-speaking side of the internet. The Russians, they were a few years ahead of me, and that's where I heard about it for the first time. But I must say I feel honored to have brought up this topic. Now many people talk and make videos about Tartaria, but I don't know how I could have been the first one to open this topic. Another topic which I think is equally interesting but has not picked up yet that much attention is the origins of sand. I believe, for example, the sands of Sahara and many other deserts did not appear in such an innocent way as we are led to believe. I think that is also one other very interesting topic which unfortunately doesn't get much attention. Another very interesting part of the puzzle, piece of the puzzle, is the mysterious selectively buried buildings and sometimes entire towns, some of which are a couple of 100 years old, made in a neoclassical style. That is also very, very interesting. I was also the first one to bring it up to the attention of the English-speaking internet. Eventually, this topic picked up as mud flood, which is kind of similar to the idea, but at least many people are becoming aware that there are hundreds and thousands of buildings buried by clay or something similar, and nobody knows how and why and when.
Okay, all right, very interesting. I was not aware that you were one of the first people there, you're saying, then, to introduce Tartaria. I do have someone else coming on after this. Martin Lidke has also picked up some of the information about the mud floods and that, and we touched upon it a little bit with the people in that time frame also being a more of a giant stature at that time. And can you just give them, the audience, since this is the first that some people may be hearing about Tartaria here within my listening audience, can you talk to us a little bit about Tartaria, just a little bit more then?
Maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, people were still enough broad-minded not to limit themselves into countries, because the only use of having countries is to make brothers fight each other. That's why countries were formed. But as the evil was taking over the planet, the people who had much higher consciousness at that time the good side, so to say, were also forced to form a country, and initially that covered almost the entire planet, and that was Tartaria. Gradually it was broken into pieces, and those pieces were defeated one by one. The last pieces that still defied the, how to say, being conquered by the forces of evil were in Siberia, but this does not mean that Tartaria was a Siberian country, or that Siberia was the center of it or the capital. I don't even think they had a capital because they were nature people. They were not fans of big cities.
Okay, so this goes over a time frame of approximately 1,000 to 2,000 years ago that this energy shift began, and the infiltration of separation and division began and conquering. Okay, so there were at that time different types of structures all around the world that are similar. So these Tartarian structures, can you describe them a little bit to us? What makes a Tartarian structure architect?
In terms of architecture, so I can only say for sure what was the last style used by the people who were either in Tartaria or were still influenced by its values and lifestyle. That was the so-called neoclassical style of building, the best example of which is St. Petersburg. There are a lot of architectural wonders there, which are quite difficult or even impossible to replicate nowadays, and certainly their history has been forged. So it is quite interesting that officially this people came up with this neoclassical style because of nostalgia of the antique style. But if we take into consideration that most likely 1,000 years of our history were simply added artificially when they were cooking up the fraudulent so-called history, then everything comes into place, and the neoclassical architecture was simply a natural, was the final stage of the antique architecture. It was its direct continuation. There was no interruption when people were not building in this style. And this idea about the 1,000 year shift in history, amongst others, this is the most famous one, is not discovered by me. It's even mainstream historians have been arguing about this since quite a long time. I think this is most likely true, and that is in terms of the last architectural style used by them. Then when it comes to its predecessor styles, now known as Roman, Greco-Roman, which are extremely misleading names because they have nothing to do with the Greeks or the city of Rome as such. How, I don't know, Tartaria at that time probably did not exist with as a country with the name Tartaria. And even at any point, the Tartarians themselves did not call themselves as such. This is the name of the country that was given by the Western historians who were mentioning, the Western European historians who were mentioning such a country. So when people were building in Roman and Greco-Roman style, maybe the word Tartaria did not exist, but the culture was there, and that's why I had to coin this new term of the survivors of Atlantis to give a name to this culture, which was a product of the knowledge brought up by the people who had some of the old knowledge remaining, and the people who blended up with the local tribal and cavemen, and this symbiosis is the result of this symbiosis is the culture and the people of Tartaria.
Okay, very interesting. Wonderful to bring and blend all that together. So what we're looking at around the world, all around the world, that is has the style similar to St. Petersburg, is this blended culture here, which goes back to being survivors of what you are placing in the term as Atlantis and Hyperborea, for the sake of a little bit of a timeline to understand how they still continued with having ancient understandings of how to work with structures that, as you're saying, which is the most significant point, is that we cannot replicate right now some of this architecture here. And also, there are a lot of references all the time to the time frames. Can you talk to us about how history has told us that colonization took place to a certain area in this amount of time and then built these structures? Can you talk to us about the improbability of that actually taking place, as history has documented or wanted us to believe that that cannot be possibly true, that who they are giving credit to building these buildings did not build them? Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, probably the most striking examples are the antique elements in the found all over South America. So they're telling us that fanatic Christians came and brought this style of building. But how come these fanatic Christians were making nude statues of pagan gods, which are found all over South America, in all these countries of South America? If you check old photos of any of the South American capitals, you will see neoclassical style buildings and plenty of statues of pagan gods. So how come they're telling us that the Christian missionaries were so fanatic that they were burning people alive, and yet they were making nude statues of non-Christian gods? This is, I think, the brightest example of how the colonial fairy tales cannot explain well how all these neoclassical buildings appeared. In India, they have, I remember, for example, there was an image how the colonialists enter for the first time the Indian cities, and in the depiction we see the neoclassical buildings already present.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Did I lose you, Sylvie?
No,
Okay. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure. Okay. So yes, very interesting. And again, that is probably the biggest highlight there that you present so well in all of your videos, that you're helping us to see and look with a more open-mindedness, allowing our logic to come in, as opposed to us framing everything that we see in front of us per what we've been told it is. What a beautiful, remarkable example with the statues that you just talked about there. How very true. So very interesting. And like as I stated, even what you also have emphasized, I've heard so many times in your videos, which I really appreciate, is that if we are suggested to think in a certain way, that it stops us from connecting to receiving the truth about something. So I find that to be a very, very beautiful part about you having videoed all of these ancient sites all over the world, so that those of us who can't get there right now have the opportunity to look again without us framing what we're seeing by just what we've been told about it. So, and that opens us up, as you're even doing now. You don't even want to just frame what appears to be these vehicle marks as even simply being that. And I heard you saying that in your videos, and then I found my imagination, that part aspect of receiving being opened. And what started to come to mind was it potentially, and it's something that Jay had brought in his talk that I did with him, that we have potentially at different times of catastrophe, we might have different scales of life coming together at once. So potentially part of what we might see might have been some super large structure interacting with the earth in certain places when it was still soft and coming from potentially this mud flood type of catastrophic experience, and still solidifying. And then us having these different scales of even vehicles that we can't imagine how big they may have even been to make some of these impressions in the earth here. So very, very interesting. So I think, to let our imaginations open up to what potentially could have taken place in our history at different times, where potentially great anomalies occur for a period of time. As Jay was saying, he thinks maybe there might have even truly been an actual physical Titan versus giants time frame in those scales of beings. And apparently then that phases itself out, and you simply have the one scale of beings in our one world, in our world here. So now that brings us to within your series of the survivors of Atlantis and Hyperborea, which you have a full 26 videos on. So I actually fell asleep listening to them one night, all night long, and kept waking up and hearing more information. So I highly recommend everyone to definitely get over to NewEarth, and it's a great place to begin, is watching that. It's those series of videos. It's on your playlist. And can you tell us a little bit then also about what you found in regards to carbon dating? Is that are they able to do it, or are you finding that we have to throw out all of their carbon dating and we're looking at millions of years of history versus what they are attempting to confine us to?
I personally have absolutely no faith in the carbon dating, because just a small aspect of why I think it's absolutely non-reliable. For example, they based it on events. How did they calculate the speed of changes in the carbon? To start with, they took events which they said we surely know when they happen, and for example, they tested the bodies which were buried under the ashes of Pompeii, and they are convinced that that happened some 2,000 years ago, approximately, very approximately. But recent and very convincing research shows that it might have happened just some, 300-400 years ago, if not even less, something around 300 years ago. So it is based on assumptions, actually. So once the speed of changes in the carbon are wrong, that means everything based on those values of the carbon changes, they're also non-reliable.
Okay, very interesting. So yes, to remind the listeners that the research that's been done, I don't remember what his name is for those.
Anatoly Fomenko.
Okay, and he has research that many are also in agreement with, at least some aspects of what he has researched, that there's been an interjection of at least 1,000 years of history that did not exist. So that, and that seems to be a very common theme with everyone that I have coming on and have been listening to, is that the last potential big catastrophic events that took place were taking place approximately 300 to 400 years ago. And now I hadn't even thought of Pompeii being amongst that. So that's very interesting. Okay, so carbon dating, throw that out. They don't really have an idea. Now, you came in here with a strong reference to the Vedic scriptures. So could you here also maybe give us a little bit of your perception about the Vedic scriptures, that in their reference of time that we are in? So do you relate to any of their beliefs in there with the existence of the earth being in a 4 billion year cycle, and we are halfway through that right now? Do you reference to that, or that life has been here potentially in form of us humans or humanoid types for millions of years? Do you have any, conclusions yourself for how you feel about that?
Thank you. Actually, this is a very, very nice question, because the Vedic scriptures are the closest accessible, openly accessible literature, which was originally given to the simple people by the so-called survivors. I call them survivors. That's the name I gave before I even knew that they have a proper name in the older books. Mavro Urbini calls them Raseyanami, means the scattered people. I didn't even know, and he tells the same story that I was telling about the survivors. So the Vedic books are the closest of what we have in written form, sadly somewhat edited, but still somehow surviving till date. And the thing is that the Vedas, at least the main body of Vedic literature, because there are different classifications and many additional books of various branches are there, but mainly they're written in Sanskrit. And the situation with Sanskrit is that if you open a Sanskrit dictionary, you will find almost every word having 50, 100 or few hundred meanings. Far more than any other language. Every word can be interpreted in many ways. And that's not the case only with abstract words and names. It is also the case with the counting of the years. So the people who are supposed to be expert in the Vedas in India, they're called pandits. So even currently, different pandits have their own interpretation of all these millions and billions that you mentioned. I think most of the people in US have heard only about one interpretation, but actually there are many. So what is my personal take? I would love to sit one day and talk with pandits who have different opinions, and maybe after that I will have my own. But I'm having the general feeling that the amount of years that you were referring to, which is the most famous interpretation, is not correct, because there are some stories like the famous story of how some unhonorable men were trying to take off the sari of Draupadi, and they were pulling the cloth, because basically a sari is a very long piece of cloth in which the women in India wrap themselves. But the Supreme Lord wanted to save Draupadi, and he supplied unlimited amount of cloth. So they were pulling and pulling, but there was no end, and they could not strip her naked and humiliate her. So this is kind of a peculiar story. And interestingly enough, we have the same story also in other legends and historic documents, which are much, much more recent. Again, this is an information that Anatoly Fomenko has compiled for us. So in general, my take is that we need to revise our understanding of the Vedic count of the years.
Okay. So to not potentially look at that as being literal, but an interpretation level. Okay. I found, the 4 billion, difficult to grasp, but I also can look at life as not having a beginning or an ending, and in infinity, there have been, versions of reality continuing in some plane, dimension, realm, infinitely. So as far as maybe simply let's then narrow down to, as you have continued to do your research, one, it's interesting that it seems that we're finding that we have to understand that what we are looking at as ancient and obviously high tech in the past, or principles that we did not understand, and potentially even the fact that the energies available to work with might have been a little bit different in different time frames and cycles that this particular plane of reality goes through. But we maybe are needing to connect ourselves, as we did with the 300, 400 years ago, there being a great catastrophe, and understanding that we are not as far away from the time scale of us being very highly advanced than we have been led to believe, for one thing. And then on the other end of it, to also open up the potential that maybe what we're seeing has gone over, millions of years of different developments in the scale of just leaving it open and letting the pieces fill in without maybe even having an exact time frame, but simply just being more open-minded and letting the pieces fall in. And now, in regards to the times being changed, then you also have a video on the Reformation and the Gregorian calendar changes. And can you talk a little bit about that, because that is very significant as to what took place at that time?
Yeah, an easy way to confuse the people is to just change their calendar.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure if it was a pivotal moment of the history, of tampering with the history, because we don't even know how was it before that. Maybe there were even more significant changes, but all has been deleted from our knowledge. So this is simply one of the last changes that we know about. How was it before that? We don't even know. But the way one of the easiest tricks they use is to interpret the letter I, which was written in fourth of the digits representing the year, as 1000. This was a very easy way to add 1000 years to the history, and then confuse everything. Once now people believe in this history, even if they find some clues, everything is so so confused that they cannot find any reference to put the puzzle together. That is one of the reasons for introducing this additional 1000 years, and then the other reason for adding them to the history was to put away in the faraway time events which were actually important, and by putting them in the faraway past, people felt more disconnected from them.
Yes, very, very significant, the disconnect. And systematically then at that time, indigenous populations, anyone practicing closer to nature, were sought after. And then also you go into, you have another video on, are there any really old books? And so let's talk a little bit also about what took place, what takes place when we're attempting to look for documented research from the past. Why don't we have any really old books?
Even when something small emerges, it will be at least the parts which are publicly available, it will be some pages which are heavily eroded, and the interpretation of the text on them could be adjusted and twisted in any way they wish. So I don't know if the really old books are hidden or destroyed, but the thing is we don't have access to them. All these so-called Roman books that are, we are often given quotations from ancient Greek authors as if these are all authentic books, but they are not. They are medieval copies. And the monks who were making them openly admit that they were copying and correcting so that they fit the newly established history. But the children in school are not told that small detail. They are told that these are original quotations of ancient authors. So as far as, for example, sometimes we find tablets in Romania. They have found some in the Middle East. They are either on metal or on clay. They are well preserved. They tend to disappear, at least from public view. Where exactly are they locked? Are they destroyed? It doesn't even matter to us, because all we know is that they disappear.
Mm-hmm. And at this time, of course, with work like yours and other people, then it's becoming more difficult for them to keep these secrets and these alterations and these eliminations from us, because there seems to be also with all of these interesting informations coming to the surface. I have a difficult time sometimes calling them revelations, since to me, revelation kind of sounds like revealing it. And I prefer to put it into the terms of unveiling. So everything coming to the surface and being unveiled that was hidden from us, we seem to be very quickly remembering also that something is different. So with these little triggers to observe these very specific points that you point out in your video sequences are wonderful triggers to activate people's dormant memories within them and to reconnect again. So again, too, this is very important, because these little bits of information that help people to reframe everything quite differently and from more of a pure reception, they're going to get triggered to remember. So yes, but again, it is within us, and I believe that we can fully receive all the true information back again once we continue with observing it different and having these triggers, meaning to stop with our left brain analysis of what's been told, but allow these new perspectives to come in. So you also continue then into you have a video called The Stolen History of All Religions. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that video brings us then into understanding that not only did they hide the old books, but the history in there? What is the history of religion that is significant for us to know right now that you have concluded is important?
The important for us right now is that all religions had a common source. Like, for example, the famous building of Taj Mahal in India. in the older layers, which are a bit difficult to see because some of the rooms are locked, and now and then we get some images from the restoration projects, we see very mixed symbols belonging to Hinduism, then to Islam. And what is the result of that? People in India quarrel even more. I mean, the tension between Hindus and Muslims only increases in the region. And it never crosses their mind that it is not about quarreling who owns this beautiful, to whom this beautiful building belongs, but maybe this means that at some point Islam and Hinduism were one and the same thing. This idea is not very popular in India. Very few people have even thought about it. But if they would have thought about it, that would eliminate a lot of religious tensions. And it's just one of the many examples. Religion is now used mostly to separate people instead of bringing them together. What to speak of bringing them together nearer to God, which in most cases it fails to do anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, not in all. Some religious movements are still nearer to the truth, but unfortunately they tend to be smaller ones. The bigger ones seem to have been already infiltrated.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And again, a very logical understanding that is such a written oxymoron into religion, but again, a programmed mind versus someone being open to true understandings. Okay, so very significant. And then you before we do the elf castles, which I'm excited to get to and talk about them, because they're so awesome. I'll have you describe them a little bit, and definitely we'll have the pictures here running below the radio show. Let's talk about what you have been finding around the world and what you call the Polygonal Stone Masonry that is similar all over the world, which again is telling us that we were more of a universal, but a worldly type civilization that was connected across the world. So what is the polygonal stone masonry structures that you have found?
What is probably you're referring to how were they made or by whom?
Actually both, both. So kind of like, inviting the audience into the fact that you have found these structures that are similar, and what is important that we understand about who potentially built them and when, and how they are similar around the world as opposed to being separated. And by this, I mean that more than likely then it seems that there was potentially a different type of transportation maybe that we were using at that time in a high-tech civilization amongst these time frames, and it was easy to travel from one country to another. Does that make sense?
Yes, the oceans and the seas, they were not separating us, they were connecting us. I don't know how exactly did people travel. How, because there are obvious proofs of connection. For example, Siberia to South America. But how did they travel? I have not seen any evidence, nor have I had any visions about it. But I have personally examined polygonal work only in Italy and Turkey. I can't remember of any other place right now, so I don't claim to be a specialist in this topic. How were they made? I don't know. In South America, they seem to have been cast out of liquid or soft stone, while from what I saw in Italy just days ago,
it's 18 hours.
It seems it was a hewn stone, although I have no clue how did they handle such large blocks and making them fit in such a perfect way. In modern times, it's difficult to even restore such walls, even when the blocks are ready. They couldn't do it, the mainstream historians. They were at one side, they were trying for a decade, and at the end, they just gave up, and they were just mixing cement and putting the blocks in a random way, not even the smooth face facing the outside. So bad. As far as them being very similar all over the world, this is obvious. Many people have talked about this already, and in some cases they're not even similar, they are identical, like Turkey and Peru. But some, when usually people touch this topic, they forget to mention usually Japan, which also has this type of work, but it is found in the relatively recent structures. And because it doesn't fit this 12,000 about the idea of a big catastrophe 12,000 years ago, with which they are trying to connect these polygonal structures, I think there is no relation at all, because we see such polygonal work also in St. Petersburg. I mean, some parts of that polygonal work, and together with the design of columns and decoration, they are identical to what we see in Baalbek, and St. Petersburg was definitely built a few hundred years ago. So I think that all of the polygonal stonework was done relatively recently and not 12,000 years ago. About the technique they used, I have no clue. I need to drink ayahuasca for, I don't know, months or years to get such revelations, to have visions about this. It's not so easy for me. And who did it? Definitely people who were related to this culture. I call them survivors. The old name is Rasean, I mean the scattered people. I'm not saying they were superhumans who came and did it themselves with their own hands. I'm only saying that the cultures that they were in touch with made these structures. As far as Egypt, I tend to be convinced based on my own kind of, I wouldn't say exactly memories from past life, but some information that I consider reliable is that it's not by chance that it is forbidden to dig in Egypt. They take it very seriously. I mean, people have difficulty burying even their dead. There are such strict rules even for making graves, just not to open the land at any cost. I do believe that below the impressive megaliths and sometimes polygonal megaliths that we can see in Egypt lies a lot more. And that is really, really old, maybe from the times when people who survived from Atlantis landed in Egypt. But what we are allowed to see, what is excavated, I think that is way more recent. I mean, some of the texts on these temples, they are basically Bible texts. Even mainstream translators confess that and say, oh, it's a mystery. I think most likely all of the polygonal stonework would be maximum 1,000 years old. Or maybe 2, something like that, but not more than that. I do not imply that we did not have super fantastic stuff 5, 10, or 20,000 years ago. I just think we don't have access to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. It seems that most of what has, survived has been mostly stone, as opposed to if there, we seem to have a little bit less of the actual pieces of technology that were here, as opposed to all of the stone structures, and as you have in some of your documentation, the tool marks that were left behind that stated, yes, there was very high-tech civilizations using high technology to create these building structures also.